Okay, good afternoon. My name is Ayesha Hardison, and I'm an associate professor of English and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Kansas, and I'm also the director of the History of Black Writing. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event celebrating 40 years of HBW, as well as African American women's writing and literary scholarship. Established by Dr. Miriam Graham at the University of Mississippi in 1983, HBW emerged during what Mary Helen Washington marked as the Renaissance of Black women's writing. Not only did Black women writers gain more visibility in the publishing world during the 1970s and 1980s, they also transformed the academy by teaching and studying a long tradition of African American women's writing. In the 1970s, this included the work of writers and scholars like Maya Angelou and Toni K. Bambara, Rita Dove, Joanne Braxton, Lucille Clifton, Nikki Giovanni, June Jordan, and Alice Walker. And in the early 1980s came the added creativity of Butler, Dove, Naylor, Sanchez, and Sean Gay, as well as theories from Lord, Tate, Christian, and Kirby. Thus, HBW is influenced by this moment of cultural production, vision, and transformation. The idea for the center specifically began when Mary Emma was a graduate student searching archives for writers beyond the ones routinely discussed at that time. Her goal was to collect every novel written by an African American author into a database to change how scholars, students, and everyday readers define and engage the classics. Later, under the auspices of the Afro-American Novel Project, Mary Emma collected books from home basements, photocopied others from libraries, and reproduced out-of-print works. She started the project with limited staff and budget, and she sustained it when neither funding nor host institutions could keep pace with her ingenuity. Her broad aim was to redefine the canon, and in this way, she has worked in the tradition of Black female cultural preservationists, community builders, and institutional deans, literal literary history makers, like librarian Dorothy Porter and cultural brokers like Toni Morrison to promote Black writing, galvanize classrooms, shift scholarly directions, forge networks of collaborators, and to cultivate a reading public. Under Mary Emma's leadership, HBW has conducted recovery work in African American literary studies with the support of the Ford Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies. It has taken root at 3 different university campuses, and among its efforts to promote research, teaching, and public engagement with the African American literary tradition, it has organized countless academic programs, including 13 National Endowment for the Humanities funded initiatives and institutes. HBW's mission has also materialized in several book publications that have redefined the field, including the Cambridge Companion to the African American Novel, edited by Mary Emma Graham, and the Cambridge History of African American Literature, co-edited by Mary Emma Graham and Jerry Ward. Over the past 10 years, HBW has grown with the implementation of the Black Book Interactive Project, also known as BPIP, which has pushed to diversify the digital humanities by enabling greater access to Black author texts, creating a schema for gathering information about HBW's corpus of novels, and arranging programs that provide scholars with DH training, research, and digital publication support. HBW staff, which currently consists of 26 people, has compiled an inventory of 7,000 fiction titles. More than 3,000 of these texts have been digitized, with roughly 1,000 accessible to BPIP scholars through an interface called Philologic, a collaboration with the Chicago Text Lab based at the University of Chicago. HBW's corpus is also a feature collection and a curation project with the Hathi Research Trust, or the Hathi Trust Research Center. Additionally, with partners Howard Ransby at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville, Kenton Ransby at Howard University, and Drew Davison at the University of Kansas, HBW is curating resources for additional engagement with this new venture, the Mellon-funded Black Literature Network. When launched next year, BLNet will translate part of HBW's corpus into a rich multimedia website, which will include podcasts, data visualizations, and a portal that generates reading recommendations for a diverse user community. With this collaborative work, HBW has forged new methods for upholding the inspired words of Black writers, for measuring their humanistic implications, and for strengthening the institutionalization of African American literary studies. This goal has always been to garner more visibility for a historically undervalued tradition, to shift what we read and how we read, to extend our understanding of what we gain from our study, and to connect with anyone doing this work to become fellow change agents as a result. To acknowledge 40 years of HBW is to honor the labor of Mary Emma Graham, as well as those that came before her, those contemporaries that undertook comparable work, and those who share in sustaining HBW with their time, donations, mentoring, lectures, publications, invitations, and countless other commitments of love, affiliation, and support. We started recognizing this year's anniversary with a plenary session featuring Richard Yarborough and Carolyn Denard, Kevin Quashie, and Jacinta Saffold at the Modern Language Association Conference in San Francisco. We then held a reception honoring Black women's biographies, namely Mary Emma's work on Margaret Walker, Shannon Green Benjamin's work on Danille K, and Tara Green's work on Alice Dunbar Nelson at the College Language Association Conference in Atlanta. This fall, we launched the Black Writing Exhibit, a collaboration with the Spencer Museum of Art, spotlighting the work of Paul Stephen Benjamin, Stephanie Dinkins, and Dred Scott. Today, we close out this wonderful year of celebration and conversation with some of our esteemed colleagues who have worked to recover and uphold Black women's literary history. Angelyn Mitchell is an associate professor of English and African American Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where she founded the African American Studies program in 2003 and served as its founding director for 10 years. Her publications include Within the Circle, an anthology of African American literary criticism from the Harlem Renaissance to the present, published by Duke University Press. Also, The Freedom to Remember, Narrative, Slavery, and Gender in Contemporary Black Women's Fiction, published by Rutgers University Press. And The Cambridge Companion to African American Women's Writing, also published by Cambridge, with Danille Taylor. A Morrison Scholar, she is a founding member and past officer of the Toni Morrison Society, and she currently serves on its board of directors. She is currently completing a biocritical study of Morrison titled Toni Morrison, A Writerly Life, forthcoming from Polity. Danille K. Taylor, PhD, is the director of the Clark Atlanta University Art Museum. The museum received its largest grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and it is in its third year of the HBCU History and Cultural Access Consortium, sponsored by the National Museum of History and Culture. This program provides funding for resources and personnel to digitize the permanent collection and to feature items from it in a traveling exhibition. Dr. Taylor is professor of African American Studies, Africana Women's Studies, and affiliate faculty in the humanities. And she has served as dean of the School of Social Arts and Sciences at CAU. She is a former dean at Texas Southern University in Houston and Dillard University in New Orleans. She is editor of Conversations with Toni Morrison, co-editor with Angelyn Mitchell of the Cambridge Companion to African American Women's Literature, as well as author of numerous presentations and articles. She was awarded a Rockefeller Foundation Award to study Black music at the Center for Black Music Research, 2 Mellon UNCF faculty fellowships, and is a member of the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi. And last but not least, Courtney Thorsson is an associate professor in the English department at the University of Oregon, where she teaches, studies, and writes about African American literature from its beginnings to the present using Black feminist methods. Her first book, Women's Work, Nationalism and Contemporary African American Women's Novels, published by the University of Virginia Press, argues that Toni K. Bambara, Polly Marshall, Gloria Naylor, Nazaki Shange, and Toni Morrison reclaim and revise cultural nationalism in their novels of the 1980s and 90s. Her writing has appeared in the volume Foodscapes, Food Space and Place in a Global Society, and various publications including Callaloo, African American Review, Melis, Gastronomica, Contemporary Literature, Legacy, and Public Books. Her new book, The Sisterhood, How a Network of Black Women Writers Change American Culture. And I'll say, Courtney just informed me that this was published this past Tuesday, so this is also a kind of debut coming out party for Courtney as well. The Sisterhood tells the story of a remarkable community of Black women writers and intellectuals how these intellectuals transform political, literary, and academic cultures. She is the recipient of a Public Scholars Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in support of the research and writing of the Sisterhood. Today, because I am excited to have these people at this event, I have several questions for them, and I will start off asking them questions, but I will reserve time for Q&A. When we get to that session, please raise your hand and unmute yourself so that you can ask your questions, or feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will read them to our esteemed guests today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor, Dr. Thorsson, and Dr. Mitchell. And I am so excited to delve into this conversation. So, Dr. Taylor and Dr. Mitchell, you all collaborated on a literary history, and I'm wondering if you could start our conversation today by talking about your experience constructing a history, what that meant for you all working together, what that meant for collaborating with your contributors, but also what it meant for the importance of the work that you were undertaking and the writers that you wanted to highlight and recover in various ways.
You want me to start, Mitch? Angie? Well, thank you so much for inviting us here today. And I'm so happy to be able to participate in this wonderful event for the history of Black writing. I think when I began to reflect on how I became engaged in this project, and I think Angie will have to fill this in because I couldn't find all my old computers, Angie, so I couldn't tell when we first started to work on this, but it had to be around 2003 or 4 that somehow the project came in front of us, and I can't even remember. Angie probably has a better memory as how we decided that we were going to work on this together. I think what the important thing was is when I came to the field, I had to find the material by myself in the library. And you would sit for hours and you could read the primary works, but the secondary works lacked any kind of relevancy to my mind to what I was reading. And therefore, the impetus for me initially would have been to try to theorize about the literature I was reading because the theory and the interpretation was lacking. And it took me not until I got to graduate school and could do an interdisciplinary study that I could put together some history along with literature and anthropology to begin to forge something that was far more based in African American culture, because all of those layers of understanding were pretty much absent because Morrison and others were not as concerned with that. They were not railing against the social system. They were studying the interior life of the Black community and Black culture and mining that for what it meant to them and what questions they wanted to answer. So that's how I ended up doing my dissertation on Morrison. And then you would bond with other scholars in going to these conferences because we were scattered all over the country. And we would go to the conferences and we would talk for hours about the literature. And I think that's where Angie and I initially met, and we bonded over our love of Morrison and worked together in the Morrison Society. So you have there are multiple networks that we forged between scholars and writers. And it was clear by the 2000s in my mind that the field had grown so complex that the opportunity to frame it for readers was very, very needed. And I thought Angie had done seminal work with her within the circle of putting together in one place the major essays of African American literary theory. That was so important. So we're always trying to put together in one place so it's easier for people to find. And that was such it's really a very seminal work that you don't have to go everywhere and find it, because this was before the internet. So you couldn't exactly go to your internet, you're on the library page and just pull down something and copy it. I went through Katrina, and I'll let her pick up the story for the part of that. I was at Dillard at the time, and Katrina hit, and it really, without, however I was attached to it, it was really the bond of our scholarship and friendship that kept us moving through it, because I had to leave my home. And I do remember, the one thing I remember more than anything else is sitting at my kitchen table in a half reconstructed kitchen working on this project, because it became my solace. You know, it's my retreat. When things get really crazy, I go to do some research, and you hide away in the archives or the stacks or whatever it might be. And Angie, I'll let you.
That was great, Danille. I'll fill in just a little. And you're right. Katrina occurred during our collaboration, and it seemed as if this project would not come to completion, but it did. We wanted to provide not only a volume that would advance the scholarship, right, but also would advance the teaching of African American women's writing. You know, for example, it was important for us to have a very fulsome chronology and bibliography, right, in order to give the contours and the context that we thought this particular project should provide for students as well as for scholars. You know, the organization, of course, it's in two parts. And, you know, one of the things too that we were mindful of is that, you know, when we participate in this particular series, the Cambridge, you know, companions and that collection, there's a type of institutionalizing that is taking place, right? And so we were very mindful of the importance of that, you know, the venue. And so we wanted to be able to present not necessarily a comprehensive history, but certainly one that was expansive and would provide, again, students and scholars with some of the background. For example, the first section, we engage the key moments, history and context. And then the second section of the volume, the expanse of genres, right? So that readers would be able to make it as usable as possible. Yeah.
Thank you, Danille and Angie. And what strikes me about what you've said is, one, your relationship, two, the various things that inform or potentially can impact the work, right? That you were putting this together while Katrina happened. So how that shifts the spaces that we can work in, but also maybe adds another layer of significance to the work that you undertake. That you said going to the library was a solace. So it also speaks to labors of love, but also the kind of space of research and rediscovery and preservation that feeds one in a particular way. But also the careful organization, but not just thinking about the research, but also thinking about the classroom, not just thinking about scholars, but also thinking about students and the importance of all of that. Courtney, it seems like there's a nice synergy between what Danille and Angelyn created and established with their work, but with what you're thinking about in terms of your forthcoming book, or not forthcoming anymore, your book that is here, The Sisterhood. And I wonder if you could start talking about your book project in regard to the title, The Sisterhood, and what it's referencing. It seems like there are some nice connections between the Cambridge edition of women's writing and thinking about this idea of the sisterhood in an earlier period.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to first just back out a little bit and say thank you, Ayesha, for taking on the leadership of HBW, for convening us here today. I want to thank Professors Mitchell and Taylor for your scholarly, editorial, institutional, curatorial labors. I'm going to look, I got my copy out, so I want to hold up the production of that collaboration we were just talking about. And I want to say thank you to Mariama Graham for for founding the History of Black Writing Project, and also for being an example to me, and I'm pretty sure all of us, about how we keep doing our work year after year. So the title, The Sisterhood. And I'm going to hold it up because people who are here, you will recognize this famous photo, The Sisterhood, 1977. And there is a short podcast episode that I wrote for the History of Black Writing Project that is available about the group. So cross currents and collaborations. The Sisterhood is the name that this group chose for themselves in February 1977 when they convened at June Jordan's apartment at the invitation of Alice Walker and June Jordan. So partly in calling my book The Sisterhood, I'm just following their lead. They capitalized it, The Sisterhood, in their agenda, their meeting minutes, and all their official correspondence right from the first meeting. So they were kind of saying, we know this is something that's named. We know that this group is important. Sisterhood also is Black and political in the sense of brother and sister. It's specific to women. It's familial, but it's also a lateral tie, not a hierarchical tie, right? So sisterhood has a lot of possibility. And I will also say, as with a much earlier version of this book, one thing that the scholar Erica Edwards helped me think about is just the word sisterhood has so much openness. So when these women got together in 77 and decided to call themselves a sisterhood, that could have turned out to be almost anything. You know, it could have been people who got together and eat and drink and socialize, which they did. It could have been people who got together to workshop one another's writings, which they didn't do so much. It could have turned into many things, but it became first a collective working to get Black women's writings published, publicized, read, studied in the way my colleagues are talking about, and taught. And then secondly, a place for Black women intellectuals to be in what was a totally necessary all Black, all woman space. So that's where the sisterhood comes from.
Thank you, Courtney. And I note that you also mentioned developing ideas in relationship to other scholars, right? You mentioned Erica Edwards, and we tend to think of scholarly work, or maybe any work, as isolating, individualistic, but what comes up, particularly in regard to Black women's intellectual culture and Black women's creative culture, is the networks and the relationships and the ties that are both professional and personal. I'm wondering what you all think about the distinction of the 1970s and 1980s for Black women's cultural production and development of literary criticism. And I'm focusing on this period because this is when HBW is also emerging, and we have these preservation projects, various kinds taking place, anthologies, but also the publication of various books, etc. And so I'm wondering what you all find distinct about this moment versus earlier moments. So I'm sure many people, and I know some of you all attended the recent conference celebrating the 50-year anniversary of Margaret Walker's conference celebrating Phyllis Wheatley, right? And we know we have a long tradition of Black women's writing, as Danille and Angelyn established in their edition. But I wonder what's distinct about the 1970s and 1980s, what is happening in that moment? Why is this such a heightened moment or really productive moment for Black women? And how might we distinguish its accomplishments from what comes before, but maybe even what comes later? And Angelyn, do you want to start?
Certainly. I would first say, I think that the emphasis on interiority, right? It's what is striking to me about the 70s, especially, and into the 80s, right? That Black women writers were deeply invested in presenting what it was to be, Black in a community, to be a Black woman, certainly, but more about the community and what what the quotidian, if you will, of Black life was. And so I think that would be where I would start with that in terms of thinking about that difference in interesting ways. You know, in terms of genre, right, there's this wide range, and there's, you know, I lean into fiction often. And so I think, for example, of those novels that are produced in the 70s that really just recalibrate how we think about Black writing, right? How we think about Black life. The Bluest Eye, for example, right? 1970. Black girlhood. You know, we now talk about that in with those particular terms, but at that moment we were not talking about that, but Morrison was, right? Or even Sula, which really just revolutionized. And, you know, I think Spillers talks about its being an eruption of funk, if you will, and taking, you know, the term from the previous novel. So I think that's where I would begin that particular inquiry, with the notions of interiority in that moment that becomes so important. Yeah.
Thank you. Courtney, do you have thoughts, or can you add to this of what's distinguishing the 70s and or 80s in a tradition of Black women's writing?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll try to sort of pick up where with what Angie just said. So we know the 70s and 80s are this period that Mary Helen Washington identified as a renaissance of Black women writers, and not just named as a renaissance of Black women writers, but enabled through her collections and volumes. I see a little bit of a turn from that 70s Black women's novels individual interiority. So Morrison, Sula, Walker's Meridian, right? Gail Jones's Corregidora, we could argue about whether that's singular or not, and then kind of 1980 as a more of a shift to the collective, like Bambara's The Salt Eaters, right? And then 82 Color Purple. So that's where we get the kind of multiple points of view and that kind of polyvocality more in the 80s, in a way that I think is a shift where in the 70s, if you get a little bit of that foundational focus, respecting girlhood, the foundational focus on individual interiority, you can think about collectives and move among perspectives and point of view in the 80s. I think we're pretty accustomed to thinking of 1970 as a watershed moment. So The Bluest Eye, Bambara's anthology, The Black Woman, you know, Walker, Morrison both have first novels. It's a year after Maya Angelou's first autobiography. But the occasion of this event made me, and the very helpful chronology in y'all's volume, made me think about 1983 as maybe a watershed moment that also helped make the shift from the individual to the collective. So Ayesha noted to me in her invitation that 83, when Mariama founded HBW, is the year that Paul Marshall's praise song for the widow comes out. And so then I looked at the Cambridge Companion and kind of like looked around just to think what else was going on in 83. And Walker wins the Pulitzer Prize for The Color Purple. In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Our Mother's Gardens, plural, 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 right? Collective we, comes out. And In Search of Our Mother's Gardens has stayed continuously in print from 1983 to the present, a really sort of rare feat for the works we're talking about. 83 is also the year that Gloria Naylor wins the American Book Award for The Women of Brewster Place. So another one of those kind of plurality. And of course, the publication of Claudia Tate's totally indispensable Black Women Writers at Work, now back in print. Amina and Amiri Baraka's Confirmations anthology of Black women writers, and Barbara Smith's Homegirls. So this kind of flourishing of the collective anthology moment seems very distinctive to me about the early 80s, including the founding of HBW. And at the risk of going on too much, just one more thing to say. My first book was about Black women's novels of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I understood while I was writing it and researching it that that was an important and distinctive time. But really, I didn't understand how particular and distinctive it was until years later. And the Sisterhood is really, the new book is really me trying to figure out how that happened. And it wasn't by accident, right? It was a bunch of Black women, intellectuals, editors, writers, journalists, and so on, collaborating to make that spectacular renaissance take place, to make Black women's writing more visible. So yeah, those are some thoughts about that. Thank you.
Yeah. And Courtney, I think your comment reminds us, just because one book is published or 5 books are published, there is still a lot more work to do, right? And a lot more thinking to do. As you continue to work in this period, there are still questions to be answered, right? There are still connections to be made. And our work is never done. So I appreciate that as well. It's not one-offs, but actually a career of work and study to be had still. Danille, Angie said interiority, and Courtney highlighted the anthologies and also the multi-voice narratives. What are your thoughts about what makes the 70s and or 80s, or the idea of a renaissance happening during this period, distinct from earlier periods that we've seen, such as the New Negro Renaissance, or maybe social realism of the 40s and the 50s? Or perhaps even what we might identify coming later?
I think that the Black arts movement and Black women coming out of that movement in that period, and in some ways I was part of that generation, the maleness of it got kind of tired. I mean, there comes a point in which the women, you've had, the civil rights movement and the assassinations and the violence in Vietnam, and Black women begin to build space for themselves, to begin to have those reflections about individuality. And then as time progresses, you move from that more personalized novel to something that's broader, if you're growing as an artist. And I think it's important, not only were there the artists creating it, but also the scholars and readers. There was a huge audience. There were so many scholars that were coming through the academy at that point. You've got, I mean, the list is tremendous. Danille K, Mary Helen Washington, Barbara Christian, Betty Parker Smith. So people are writing about this literature, and they're insisting that you read it and helping people interpret it. And then you have the sleuth, I would call Toni Morrison, of publishing people, working with them, working the system. So you have the scholarship, you have the publishing, you have the burgeoning self-confidence. So when Black is beautiful, they didn't quite mean Black women took this seriously and began to find out what was beautiful about them. And it's not an easy just put on makeup. You really navigate that. What does beauty mean? How does a Black girl become beautiful? The bluest eye. And then the sisters, what if 2 women are best friends, as in Sula, but what if they do one's free, one's domesticated? What did both sides of that coin look like? And Morrison then just goes into the whole long story with Song of Solomon. Let's go back and recapture, let's do the migration back south, and take a male protagonist with all the women who would have kept him together in a sense, and the brother who's the capitalist, and the sister who's the seer, and can he fly, can he not fly, what does family mean in that sense? So there's a geography and a journey that's explored, that the space, the venue, the audience, it's like the genie was let out of the bottle and you couldn't put it back in. Black women were not going back in that bottle. And it just, they became the mothers of a whole nother generation. The contemporary literature is nothing without people studying the past. If you haven't studied Walker and Allison and all of these people, how can you call yourself? Well, we won't. I'm not trying to be hierarchical, but the ones who are most serious, it has impacted all literature around the world. The
Yeah,
things.
and I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, no.
I just was gonna say, and I would add the kind of radicalness of not only Black women's confidence and carving space for themselves, but also loving each other, right? That those writers as well being included and being unapologetic about that, and how radical those ideas were that they sparked such backlash at the same time, right? So they may be more common now, but then it really was radical and threatening. You said the genie was out the bottle, and that genie was threatening, and that genie was radical. So just to highlight that as well, we've been talking about what makes this very distinct and this period very distinct. And one thing that struck me, Courtney, in your book, and part of what struck me is that at HBW, we've been processing our own papers. So things that Mary Emma has collected, things that HBW has produced in terms of its programming, etc. So I've been thinking a lot about archives, and in the field, in the African-American literary tradition, we're thinking about archives, recovering our histories, etc. And I'm wondering, Courtney, in your book, you mentioned that this may be one of the last generations, the 70s and 80s might be, or the writers that emerged then might be the last generation of writers that have paper archives, right? They have material archives as we move into a digital world. And I'm wondering, given everyone's work in literary history, either that idea about the paper archive or to think about how the archive has evolved. This is also coming up for me recently because I heard a talk with Irma McLaurin, and she was really emphasizing that we are all the archive, and that what we do, what we write, our intellectual journeys are worth documenting, that it has value. And so I'm just wondering about your thoughts on archives in general, either in the work that you have done, that you are doing, but also Black women's relationship to archives. And maybe Danille, if you're willing to start.
Why not? Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because I'm now at a museum, so I don't get to teach literature now, but having documents of any type of creative form become an archive of a person's expressions and thoughts and feelings at a particular moment. I know if we know anything from the way the government can go in and retrieve anything that's digital, they haven't gone. It's just who has the access to Microsoft's deep
back files,
what you call it, server, where the material is. So I am hoping some of our brilliant young computer scientists and stuff will figure out how we can capture these emails and everything, because I don't see how we're going to particularly be able to print off everything, and everything is put in a cloud. But that stuff really doesn't disappear. It feels ephemeral, like I couldn't find which laptop I wrote something on, but if it was particularly across the internet, it could probably be retrieved in some ways. And so I think it's a different task to become that kind of archive. And I really think, and I've heard presentation by Black archivists and stuff, and they're really invested in this. So I think there's a very strong community in the library, archiving community, that is working on this. And as a digital person, but there was one thought that just slipped through my mind. But the archive, we can't, the one thing is that the one reason why the archive is so important, because we get caught in this present age with taking whatever ephemeral swipe across as being what is. And without going through the archive, you can't connect together what's real and what's not real. You have to have students and young people need training and how to discern, critique, analyze what comes in front of their faces, because somebody's always trying to sell them and influence them for their own gain.
So obviously I think we were always on the same page with the importance of the archive, but technology is not something that we should just fear, but it has brought gains to our preservation. And the archive still requires a kind of development of skill to read it and to understand it. Courtney, what are your thoughts about archives?
So there's a story that the modernist Jeremy Braddock tells in his book about archives, that when the Beinecke started going around to all the Harlem Renaissance authors and asking people for their letters and papers, Anne Spencer, one of my favorite poets, writes a letter to Langston Hughes that said, I had no idea everybody else was keeping their stuff. Like, you were all saving your drafts and copies of your letters all along, and all the men had been, and Spencer had not. So you have to start with the creator of the material valuing it enough to keep it and having the resources to keep it. And then you need a repository that also values it and can care for it and preserve it, which we could say is the case with Alice Walker's archive, because she saved everything, you know, going far, far back, including childhood journals and little mini cassette tapes from her answering machine in her apartment. And Emory basically preserved that organization. So you're looking at Alice Walker's organization system. So value, care, and preservation. I see that Professor Pickens put in the chat about Butler's papers at Huntington, and I was having a related thought, which is a great deal of the research for my book I conducted over multiple visits to the Women's Research and Resource Center at Archives at Spelman College, which holds both Audre Lorde and Toni Cade Bambara's papers. I probably didn't understand as a graduate student why much of that material wasn't available digitally. And I now have, and also want to say the archivist Holly Smith has done scholarly work on this, so I recommend Holly Smith's work on this. Now, I have a different kind of understanding in terms of the like Hurstonian go there to know there about the Spelman archives. So the idea that they have every issue of Sage, which is like the first place Farrah Griffin ever published an article, and lots of other scholars of that era, and that you have to go to Spelman to look at the full run of Sage, or to look at Toni Cade Bambara's, you know, wild handwriting in her journals. There's something to that too, that there's a kind of commitment required. And so I don't think the rush to digitization is the only way to go. And also some things are not for everybody. So Audre Lorde's dreadlocks are held at Spelman. And as Alexis Gumbs has written about, she has a piece called Dread Archive, you can't just walk in and touch Audre Lorde's hair, and that's appropriate. Not anyone should be able to walk in and just make physical contact with those cut off dreadlocks in person. And similarly, I think there are many people in this Zoom room who are probably know better than I do that in later years, Morrison was communicating largely through texts. So that's not even an email archive, right? We're never gonna have that, and that's okay. Some things are not for everybody to consume, you know?
Yeah, the experience, and I also do archival research, and I love going to the archive. So there is something definitely different. I can co-sign that about going to the archive, but I also like the provocative statement that everything is not for everybody as well, and everything isn't meant to be kept, perhaps. Angie, do you have thoughts about archives, either your experience with it or where you see them developing or their continued usefulness?
Yes, I think there is so much in terms of continued usefulness, right? I don't think we have, as the saying goes, scratched the surface. There's still, and because so much is now digital, that does help in continuing that that dig. Because I think, for example, some of the essays that Morrison wrote that were literary and cultural criticism, right? That were in the New York Times and other publications in the 70s, which I'd find just fascinating because there were so few Black voices doing that kind of work in those types of venues at that time. And so that still, I think, those kinds of pieces, right, that we could unearth. Pieces, for example, that we find in places where we may not expect. For example, Essence, Ebony, and Jet, right? And the predecessors of those. So there's just still a lot in the material archive, right, that we need to take up. Interviews. I think we haven't done enough with interviews because there we can get many, many breadcrumbs, if you will, in directions to go, who was talking to whom, right, in these moments where these creative minds were generating what we now have as text. So yeah, I think that while we might be concerned that the material archive is leaving, I think still with these generations, I think still there's much more to do there. And it is exciting to have the opportunity, right? Because especially for, scholars who may have difficulty going to archives, right? What are we to say about that, right? And so many, and so often women are doing a lot of the caregiving, and so they can't, make these wonderful trips to do these things. So yeah, I think there's enough for us all and enough work still to be done. Yes.
Yeah, enough work for us all as we continue to grow the archive.
Mm-hmm.
But as you say, think about access to it as well to enable our intellectual or creative endeavors. We've talked about a lot of writers. I think Naylor has come up, Paul Marshall, and I have to correct myself. I said Pauli because in my head, I also work on Pauli Murray, but Paul Marshall. Obviously, we've talked a lot about Morrison. I'm wondering if there are other writers that you all think that we need to engage more, or we think we know, but need to rethink. And Courtney, I'll start with you. Are there any writers that we should return to or reconsider?
This is like at the last day of class when my students ask me, what's your favorite book? The answers are infinite.
Well, I didn't say rank, so at least I didn't,
That's right,
go
exactly.
there.
So a little rethinking of two from the period I write about, and then kind of where I want to go with some contemporary writers. Firstly, as we have said in this conversation, I just want to encourage us to keep rethinking of writers, Black women writers, in terms of their collaborations and networks. And Morrison does end up being such an important case study for that, because she is both and simultaneously unparalleled in aesthetic achievement, but not singular. And I say in the project, I think she esteemed Gail Jones and Toni Cade Mumbara to be her aesthetic equals as writers, for example, but just also to think about Morrison as part of a network. So that's just kind of a reframing. The other one from that period is to understand Michelle Wallace not only as the author of Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman, which is the book most associated with her, but as one of the most insightful cultural critics, period. But in terms of the very contemporary, Angie and Danille, you say in the introduction to the Cambridge volume that the short story is often overshadowed by our attention to the novel. And this is so true. And also, I think so far in the 21st century, Black women short story writers are on fire. So I'm thinking of like Disha Philia, Danielle Evans, Nafisa Thompson Spires, Zizi Packer. So I'm going to try teaching a brand new 200 level Black women short story course in the spring. And my hope is that my students and I can work together to have some tools to think about the particularity of the short story in our contemporary moment.
So I'm sure now, Courtney, you have an audience of people who would like to take your class now. Angie, without feeling pressure to limit it to one or two, but do you have thoughts about people that we should be engaging more, we should be rethinking or reframing in various ways?
Yeah. And Courtney, I hope that Crystal Lucky's essay is helpful as you construct that course from the Cambridge. I am going to put Naylor back into the conversation, because I'm very pleased that we are having a moment where there's some attention to her work, right, with the archive that is at I think Sacred Heart, and the events that have been built around her archive. But at the same time, I think her novels are still under engaged in ways that I'm surprised by. So she's one that I think we really are in need of reclaiming, if you will, in some interesting ways, particularly because of the subject matters that she engaged in those moments that were quite prophetic. I'm thinking, for example, of Linden Hills and what it has to say about Black aspiration, right? And so she's one. Another one is Shirley Ann Williams. And I would hope that we aren't going to not engage her simply because there was only the one novel, but what a novel it was, right? The Dessa Rose. And so I find that she is someone else that we need to think about, as well as her poetry and as well as her literary criticism give birth to Blackness, which is a really important work that helps us to think about Black aesthetics, right? Especially at the time when she was writing. So I would add those two, especially. There's so many more.
Yeah, but Angie, you make a good point about writers that we are familiar with, but that we can still return to them. And if Zora Neale Hurston is a model, she's had a renaissance several times over, right? And rightly so. And so that can happen for other Black women writers as well. Danille, what would you put on our list for rethinking, reframing, rediscovering?
Well, I'm going to second some of the names in the chat. I mean, I think it's interesting. Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, was just so prophetic when we were it felt like the world was burning up. And I taught it in one of my classes. I don't know, we almost all had a nervous breakdown. It was pretty scary at the time. But I think her other books, where she's playing with gender, are really important. How she could imagine, what does it take to procreate? Those texts are really imaginative and provocative. And Gail Jones, I do think Gail Jones scares people. But I think she is more than worthy of, and she keeps writing, and I think we forget she's still producing. She's had quite a few books come out recently, which we need to connect to her previous work. And she's a complicated woman. So that's a biography that I think is interesting. And I think I love autobiographies like from Pauli Murray. Sometimes people have to tell their own personal story. Now, you may have to fact check it against other things, but autobiographies, be they somebody like Viola Davis, when she reads her autobiography, it's really insightful to hear her voice tell her own story. And I think Pauli Murray's last autobiography, and I'm skipping on the name of it. I mean, she did so many incredible things. And I think in terms of legal, not just history, but many of the courses that have been instrumental in changing the world we live in today, she brought forward because she was such a almost intersectional person
Mhm.
who had, because she had no place, then she could find a place. She was in the break in a way. And it
Mhm.
was very painful for her.
Mhm.
But people forge new directions for us all where we thought there was no path.
Mm.
And so there are probably other very important personal stories that people can mine for insight and understanding our current and past moments. Um,
Mm. Yeah,
I always
thank
put
you.
Morrison in because you always got to do Morrison.
We
Because
can
I always
always.
know when you teach, you always think, yeah, but did you go back and read X? Because she
Mhm.
talked about it there. It was either in an interview, an essay, or something. But there are plenty. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, we can always return to Morrison. And just for posterity, I'll just read some of the names in the chat. So Alice Childress, J. California Cooper, Ann Petrie, Francis E.W. Harper, Tina McElroy Ansa, Marita Golden, Alice Dunbar Nelson, Adrian Kennedy, Margaret Walker, and Bell Hooks. So that was a wonderful list that we've generated. And obviously, there are many more names that we can add. And I encourage you to continue to add them in the chat when they come to mind. Danille, you mentioned that you were reading Octavia Butler recently with your class, and it was almost scary how prophetic it was for our current moment. I'm wondering, for the last questions, or the last question I will articulate, for those of you that have a burning question or you've been waiting to jump in, please begin to put your questions in the chat or use the raise hand function, and I will recognize you so you can articulate your question. But my last question is, for all of you, what do you think is the importance of African American women's writing at this moment? So you named Butler as being really important at this moment, and Parable of the Swords, thinking about politics and labor and sexuality and compassion and feeling, and thinking about freedom and climate change. Many of the things that we're thinking about and grappling with today. You can either think about this in terms of other writers or other texts, but the broader question is, what's the meaning and what's the importance of Black women's writing right now? And maybe Angie, we could start with you.
That is such a great question, right? At this very moment, where I see really interesting work taking place, and that's with Black women playwrights, right? They seem to be really at the forefront of some of those pressing issues that you just listed. And so I think it's fascinating to consider how the use of performance, right, it gives the possibility for engagement with those issues, especially from a Black woman's perspective. And so I think that becomes very, very necessary in this moment. And it adds a voice that would not necessarily be included in those conversations. Yeah, perspective. Yeah.
And I imagine performance allows for conversations between literature and drama, but also music and various art performances and the like, a kind of interdisciplinary understanding or multimedia understanding of the art and performance as well.
Exactly. And audiences,
Yeah, and audiences. Danille, thoughts about the importance of Black women's, African American women's writing at this moment?
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about if we were writing, putting together the book we had, I think one area that we would probably be considering and debating more than we probably did at the time is how do we define Black women? And I think I'm impressed with all the African women writing, African European women writing, or Black women writing in Europe, and a more inclusivity of Caribbean writers. And I think that's because because we are more global, period, that Black is supposed to be very broad. So we need to include those voices and perspectives. And of course, Black women's writing, because Black women's perspectives are important.
And we are global and connected transnationally as well.
Exactly. So it's, but I would broaden it even to how we, who are those voices and things we need to read and pay attention to.
Thank you. And Courtney.
Black women's writing is always important in every period, predating the nation state. But for the right now, I think that African American women's writing, both from the past and currently, has the possibility for us to recapture the critique of capitalism and the kind of economic thinking that was central to Black feminism in earlier periods, but seems to have slipped from our Black feminist politics in literary studies particularly. So I would say I saw Trudeau Harris mention Alice Childress in the chat. Of course, Professor Harris is the premier scholar of Childress's work. My students, we've read over the past few terms a few different excerpts of One of the Family. I mean, students are so ready to think about labor and unionization, right? So there. Right now, June Jordan was a consistent, constant advocate for a free Palestine. Read Jordan's 1980 volume Civil Wars is the place I would go for that. I also would say more broad, sort of what I think about my job as a scholar and teacher of African American women's writing has been really interesting, because between about 2014 and now, students seem way more attuned to the idea that literature is a necessary tool for liberation. So it seems to me, whether it's June Jordan's poem about police violence, or it's any of Octavia Butler's works, more prophetic, or giving us new ways of thinking about gender, or whether it's Toni Cade Bambara saying we need to concentrate on Blackhood instead of manhood or womanhood, which my students read as a gender critique, right? Whether it's any of that, our job is to give young people, activists, parents, teachers, school board members, whatever they're bankers, whatever they're going to go on to do, tools and literature that consoles them or inspires them or makes them laugh and helps them keep going and foment racial justice in whatever their lane is going to be. So needed now, just like it always is, and better understood by young people as part of liberation than it has been in a long time, the literature.
Thank you, Courtney. That seems like a good place to pause and allow people to put questions in the chat, or for people to use the hand raising function to ask a question. And I see Dr. Pickens first.
Sure. I don't want to preempt Tara Green's question in the chat, so I will.
Okay.
Yeah. How do we define writers/writing? I am also thinking of Black women activists who wrote for Black newspapers in the late 18th century through early 20th century. And then there's a response. Yes, Ida B. Wells Barnett, among others, was an important voice.
Thank you, Dr. Pickens, for articulating the question in the chat. Danille, Angie, and Courtney, how do we define writers writing? And Dr. Green is thinking about Black women activists who wrote for newspapers in the late 18th century through the early 20th century. So individuals like Ida B. Wells. So are there different ways that we should be thinking about Black writing more expansively?
Well, I think that, yes, absolutely. That, when we are talking about Black women writers, I think we are talking about those that wrote, fiction and nonfiction, right? As well as those that wrote what we now call for a public, engagement. And that goes back to my comment about the archive, right? And we need to be able to have access to those writings in order to do the work that we need to do with them, not only in our scholarship, but also in our teaching, right? Yes, yes, so absolutely. Yeah, I think it is that expansive that the definition is.
Dr. Pickens, did you want to?
Sure. So thank you very much for this. I have two questions. One is more philosophical and the other is practical. So the first one is that so much of the writing that I'm thinking of is also accompanied by the act of editing. So I know that Dr. Thorsson, you talked about the fact that they didn't read and edit each other's work, but that Toni Morrison and Alice Walker at points functioned as an editor, compiler, curator of folks' work. And I also saw Jessie Redmond Fawcett in the chat as well. And then also the curatorial and editing work that's represented here today. So I'm curious about where editing sits, because it doesn't feel like organization, but it also can't be, we'd be remiss if we didn't kind of think about how Black women are shaping each other's work or shaping the work of others. And for Jessie Redmond Fawcett in particular, bringing people into the fore. And then the practical question is, for those of us who do have personal archives, how should we perhaps be thinking as scholars about preservation, about where we deposit them, how we open up these conversations with spaces, and maybe how we choose appropriate spaces. There was that brouhaha about Toni Morrison using Princeton versus Howard, etc. So yeah, thank you.
Anybody want to start?
Let me start at the last one. The other one. Well, and I think that's it is interesting, and same could be said of Alice Walker giving her papers to Emory. Sometimes some of the more endowed institutions can guarantee the care and preservation and ultimately access that other places cannot. And so you could give your things to, or I don't know, institution X, because I work in HBCU, so I'm not going to throw any names out or anything, or a public library. But if you don't, you almost have to tell somebody you have to have the resources to catalog and do all the proper things so one can have access to an archive. And that those limited resources are problematic in many institutions. Some institutions buy collections, which is interesting, that relatives or others may sell them to, or the person themselves will get financial gain from it, which is their work, and it's their right. But if you were going to, so I guess kind of distilling back, because I know Dr. Pickens, you are an editor and a scholar of your own right.
It is a self-interested question. I
Make
fully,
sure it's an acid papers, the right folders, so that when you make decisions, it's in great shape. So those climate controls and the right housing for paper materials is a very simple way to begin that process of being clear how you're archiving. And then that's what I'm not an archivist. So I don't know how people decide what archives are going to accept, what papers they're willing to accept. And maybe my colleagues have a different opinion, or they can answer another part of the question.
I'll just pick up on the archiving question that Dr. McLaren and again, I don't know what her criteria is for accepting, but that she is building a digital archive. I think it's called the Black Feminist Archive, and that she is accepting, materials and papers from other people. But again, I don't know the criteria for it. But she was in this talk I recently heard her give as part of another HBW program, that she was really emphasizing everyday individuals being invested in collecting their materials and keeping them, and providing space for that, and to even just put it in a storage space. If you need space in your house, put it in a storage space so that it is preserved, and that you're contributing to it until you can find a repository for it. But I got the sense that she was receiving things as well, but I don't know the kind of how she's evaluating what's contributing to building it. But I know that she imagined it being inclusive and related to Black feminist methods, investments, and politics. Dr. Pickens also asked a question about editorial work and I guess contributions to writing in that regard as well, or cultural production. Yeah, Angie, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna hop in on the parts of the question. I really think that we need to do better in terms of our graduate education, right? That some of these questions need to be engaged in when we are being trained about how we maintain our own archives, or what that means. Of course, we all think of things that it would have been nice to have had some formal engagement with in our training, and I think that's one of the areas. Contracts I think would be another area that we need to talk about that. But also what do we do when we archive our own work? That I think really needs to be a part of the training that takes place in graduate studies. In terms of editing, I'm really very happy that you asked that question, because we know that the way that the system that many of us operate in does not value that work in the same as it values single authored works, right? Which I think is really a travesty in many ways, because the work that one does when one edits can be, in many cases, more helpful, more accessible, more productive for scholars and students, for the work that we do as scholars and as teachers, right? And so I think we really need to reconsider how we make these kinds of value judgments in terms of that work, because without the work that editors do, and this has been historic, especially in the African-American literary tradition, right? We can go back to, say, Arthur P. Davis, right? And Sterling Brown and those works that, how those became so necessary. Kenneth McKinnon, right? All of those works that without the anthologizing, as Courtney suggested with the 80s, without that anthologizing, what would the field look like? In terms of not only primary, but also critical works. So I think that we really, really owe those who do that work a great debt.
Second everything you just said, Angie. And I also, Ayesha, at the top, you said, described the work of the History of Black Writing Project as work of love, affiliation, and support. And I think collecting work, archival work, and editorial work are the work of love, affiliation, and support. But also, as this conversation suggests, it would be great if they could be the work that gets you a job and gets you tenure, and that you learn more about how to do in graduate school, to get away from the language of labor and love, so we could do it with love, but not be compensated only with love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think adding to this, different than editorial work, is the other work that tends to be uncompensated is reviews. Um, reviewing journal articles, reviewing books, that kind of labor as well, which is really integral to the profession, is anonymous, but critical and key, but also not recognized as part of the production of things, and development of the tradition. I'm just looking at the chat to make sure I don't miss any questions. If I have Mr. Question, can you repost it so it's at the top? Other questions for Danille, Courtney, or Angelyn? I wonder if I could ask you all. Hello, Kevin Kwashi. Thanks for your comment. I wonder if I could ask you all, what are you reading right now?
I can go.
Okay.
I'm in my office, so it's right here. I'm reading Patricia Spears Jones's newish volume of poetry, The Beloved Community. Patricia Spears Jones is one of the younger members of the Sisterhood who really supported my research and participated in research interviews, and is also one of these kind of amazing women of that generation who has perhaps had her greatest success most recently. So I'll share that. And then the other thing I have sitting here is I had brought to the Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival in Jackson this a poetic equation, conversations between Nikki Giovanni and Margaret Walker. This was a gift to me from Emily Lordy when my first book came out. And the copy that Emily gave me was signed by Nikki Giovanni. It's a first run of the first book that Howard University published. And I had never known who the editor was. So there is reference to an editor in these conversations. And I found out in Jackson last week, because she talked about it, that it was Paula Giddings. And so I had this with me because I was rereading it just for inspiration. So speaking of unseen editorial work about affiliation and love, it turns out that one of our most important historians, Paula Giddings, had been the silent, unnamed editor. So I'm rereading this for inspiration.
Angie and Danille, is anything on your bedside, on your desk right now?
Oh, a stack to include Courtney's new book. In terms of fiction, Mecca Sullivan's Big Girl, that I'm reading that now. And I'm also teaching a Baldwin class this semester. So I've been revisiting his essays, which offer much to us in this moment as well. Yeah.
I just finished teaching in my graduate course, Just Above My Head, by Baldwin. And Danille, any recommendations?
Like I said, I'm in the law and I'm in the museum now. I have been obsessed with how do I get this clear?
You might have to hold it right in front of your face. Yes.
That's better?
And Lowe.
Anne Lowe, who was the couturier who designed Jackie Kennedy and other fabulous gowns for the high society. There's a show at the Winter Theater in Wilmington, and I'm very obsessed with her work and reclaiming other dresses and design by other Southern Black women dressmakers and designers. And I'm on this crazy little passion project to see what else we can reclaim, so I can try and build an exhibit that speaks to the university's 300 fashion majors. At the university, we have 300 students in that program, and to see a exhibit centered around the traditions of Black women's high fashion, I think would be extraordinary. Won't be cheap,
That does sound extraordinary.
And we
And
also have, there's also a novel that I read that was about Anne Lowe that Piper Hughley on our faculty wrote. And I'm just going to blank on the name of the novel, which really got me interested in this subject. And so it's just like going to the archives, whatever the archives is, and finding the material and then filling in the histories. Without history, you have no context about anything that comes in front of your face.
yeah, that's worth repeating. Without history, you have no context. And I think I speak for everyone in thanking you, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Thorson, for joining us, for being part of this generative conversation, and helping to celebrate HBW's 40th anniversary. And I thank you all in attendance, who are online and who posted in the chat, who shared your thoughts and ideas as well. I feel like this moment is not only extending the history and legacy of HBW, but also realizing, making concrete the various networks that we are all connected in various ways, the work that we're doing, but that gets realized in moments like this, in which we share space and serve as interlocutors for each other and think alongside each other. So thank you so much for all in attendance, and thank you for joining us and celebrating HBW. I also just wanted to recognize our sponsors, which are the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at KU, the Hall Center for the Humanities, the Department of English, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. And if I can say as closing, if you have enjoyed today's programming or other things that HBW has done, please follow us. We're on all the social media, so you will find out more information of what we have forthcoming. And if you've also enjoyed this programming, please considering donating to HBW. You can find a link on our website, or Sarah, our project manager, has helpfully put in the chat. Thank you for supporting our programming, long-term friends and collaborators of Dr. Graham. Thank you for showing up to me as well and helping me as I take on this role and continue this legacy. I hope you all have a good evening, and just thank you very much. 40 years is a big deal, and we're happy to still be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ladies.